Why can't we have small trucks here in America? There are tons of midsize and small trucks sold around the world, but we don't get them here in America. What are the reasons? Well, today I'm going to break down for you the trifecta of why we can't have them in a little bit of detail. Welcome back to All Cars Y'all. I am John, and I did a video some time ago that was really successful and got a ton of comments about why we can't have small trucks here in America, and specifically from the point of view of fuel economy standards. Now, many of those comments were very favorable, some were a little scary, some were rude, and a few were from people who'd been in the industry. But my intention with that video all along was it was just one part of the reasons, plural, we can't have small trucks here in America. And I did not make that clear. So this is a sequel to that video, digging into some of the other factors around why we can't have small trucks. Now let's address small trucks. When you look in areas like Brazil, they have the Chevy Montana or the Fiat Toro, things like that, the Ram 700, those aren't brought here. And many people commented like, this guy must be an idiot, he's never heard of the Ford Ranger. Well, just because the nameplate has been used continuously does not mean the truck is still small. The modern Ford Ranger, Tacoma, Nissan Frontier, Chevy Colorado, Canyon, GMC, they're all closer in size to the mid-size trucks of the 90s. That's how big mid-size trucks have become. And many people have brought up the Maverick as the new small truck, but it's not really that small. I ask you, do you consider the Ford Explorer to be a small SUV? If the answer is no, then the Maverick's not small. The Maverick actually is dimensionally very, very close to the Ford Explorer in length, width, height, as well as the Dodge Durango. So while it's small by today's standards, it's not small compared to what we had in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So that leaves a huge hole in the market. And why can't we have these small trucks? So I've divided it up into three different things. I'm using a triangle because, well, you can't fix a triangle. You can't distort a triangle without breaking it. And the first one is a broad category I'm calling regulation. Now, this is about three different things. First off, if you haven't watched my other video talking about, I call it the EPA, but it's really the NHTSA and their CAFE standards, be sure to watch that first. But generally speaking, our government has put in place regulations since about 2008 on light trucks, setting their fuel economy standards based on the footprint of the vehicle, the distance between the wheels and the wheelbase itself. So the bigger the footprint, the less gas mileage it has to achieve. That's one of the reasons the Maverick is the size it is because they had to stretch it to lower the fuel economy requirements they had to meet. And it's part of the reason some of these other smaller trucks from other areas can't come here. Now, there's a ton more information over there on that other video about how that all works. But the second portion of it is many people have said, wait a minute, you're forgetting the influence of the manufacturers and their lobbyists on these regulators. And, no, I didn't. Because here's the deal. If the EPA was in a box and they came up with a plan that incentivized automakers to make their products bigger so they didn't have to meet as stringent a fuel economy standard, that's the EPA's problem. That's the EPA's fault. They're meant to set the regulations that Congress is dictating. There's a whole political discussion there we're not going to get into. But if the industry, if the automakers and their lobbyists are coming to the EPA and saying, here's what we need to meet consumer demand, and the EPA is just like, sure, let's go ahead, and they don't see the downside. They don't see that they are incentivizing larger vehicles so that they can meet lower standards. That's still the government's fault. That's still the regulators' fault. Yes, the industry is still at fault there for pushing larger trucks. But the regulators, as representatives of Congress's desires, are the backstop. They are supposed to be protecting everyone, and they have almost the unlimited abilities of the federal government to enforce it. If they're not, it's still the regulator's fault. The second thing is the chicken tax. Now, I've done a whole video about that. Please check it out. But when you look at around the world and you see things like the Chevy Montana, or you see the new Mitsubishi, or you see whatever it happens to be, why isn't that being brought to America? Well, it's because of the chicken tax. This is a tariff that has been in place for decades. Because back in the 60s and 50s, America was dumping cheap chicken into Europe. Europe got mad about it and they either banned it or tariffed it, and America responded with its own tariffs on multiple items, one of which was focused on Volkswagen. But it applied for light trucks being imported to America from around the world. Check out that other video if you want more information on it, but there's trucks around the world that could come here to America, but they would be subject to a 25% tariff. So we don't get them. Now, interestingly, there is some vehicles that are still brought to America in spite of this tariff. General Motors makes Buicks and I believe some Cadillacs over in China. They still bring them here in spite of that 25% tariff, or 27.5% in the case of China, and they just pay it. But a lot of other trucks don't come here. And part of that is that the people I've talked to in the industry are talking about, like, they do the consumer research. There is not a huge market for small trucks, and I definitively disagree with that. There are tradesmen, delivery people, bricklayers, painters, and others who all want those rugged trucks from the 80s and the 90s, but they don't have them anymore. They want them to be brought here. But automakers have figured out that there's not enough market for it. The third thing is safety. Now, several people commented that when you look back at the 80s and the 90s, like the S10 and the Ranger and the Nissan Hardbody, things like that, they weren't very safe in a wreck. And that's keeping small trucks from existing. And I definitively disagree with that. If you have a Nissan Versa, a Mitsubishi Mirage, a Honda Fit when they were sold here, if these manufacturers can make these tiny little cars meet our current safety standards, they could make a small truck meet it as well. Now, granted, that small truck could not be as small as it used to be. They'd need greater crash protection, thicker A-pillars, and thicker doors for the side impact. But if you can make a Mitsubishi Mirage meet our current standards, then you can make a truck to meet it as well. And that leads into the second big portion of the triangle, which is consumer preference. And this came up a lot in comments on that other video of people don't want small trucks. And I disagree with that. Yes, Americans like big vehicles. Americans associate big vehicles with power and luxury and prestige, and trucks have moved upscale substantially over the decades. But there's still a market for those small trucks. There's still those tradesmen out there, and there's still those people who need a truck for every once in a while. I believe truly there's hundreds of thousands of people, buyers, who are waiting for a small truck, but they're being stuck in something much bigger than what they actually want. It's going to take a manufacturer to come in and try to break the mold and offer a small truck for everyone. It might be a unibody, it might be four-door, it might have a small bed on it. It may not be what we remember from the good old days of the Toyota truck or the Nissan Hardbody or the Isuzu Pup, for example, of a single cab with a long bed. But that demand still exists. Now, manufacturers have tons of data, reams of data saying what consumers actually want. And maybe there's a disconnect between price, truck, capability, and I'm not sure we're ever going to see a truck like the old Toyotas, body on frame with a long bed and a single cab, because of consumer demand. But there's a ton of consumers out there that want that smallish truck with some capability for their business or for their personal use. People keep saying it's consumer preference, but there's still an untapped demand in there, and it's going to take a manufacturer, and I'm afraid it might be one of the smaller ones like Mitsubishi that comes in and says, here's a new truck, give it a shot. And the last one is corporate profits, and you can't ignore that. If you get past everything else, if you get past the regulations, you can meet the fuel economy standards, you can import it to America or build it somewhere it doesn't have a tariff, you can meet consumer demand, are you going to make enough profit on it? And that is probably the insidious part of this whole conversation. Right now, what we have is, because of the chicken tax and because of other factors, we have our automakers incentivized to sell larger and larger and larger and more profitable vehicles. And you can see that with Dodge, Ford, and Chevy offering base level full-size trucks and then offering trim lines above it at substantial prices, all in the name of profits. Well, if you have a factory and you can make, let's say, 150,000 trucks a year, do you want to make the F-150 that's going to make 10, 20%, maybe more percent profit, or a brand new small truck that's going to make $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 of profit? You're going to go for the bigger one. So right now, they don't feel like they've tapped into the upper end of what people are willing to spend. My concern is that the American manufacturers, specifically Ford and GM, have hollowed out their lineup. They're not offering cars, they're not offering small cars, they're not offering a lot of small hybrids, they're offering sport utilities and trucks, and they've left this hole in the market. And when there is a recession, because there will be a recession, people are going to flock to what is cheaper. And it's going to be the smaller cars and smaller trucks and smaller SUVs. I encourage GM and Ford and Dodge to bring smaller trucks here and bring, honestly, cars and smaller cars back to the market. I understand why they're not, because they're chasing profits, because they're chasing incremental increases for their shareholders, part of which is to fund the move to EVs. But corporate profits are also what's moving this. And you can see that through the 80s and the 90s. The Japanese manufacturers arguably built the better trucks. Initially, like the Ford Courier and the Chevy Love, those were rebadged Japanese cars. The American manufacturers built their own, the Ranger and the S10. You still had the Mazda B Series, the Mitsubishi Mighty Max, the Nissan hard bodies, and eventually those faded away. And in some cases, like Mazda, they moved to the Ford platform because the profit margins were so small. And eventually those trucks went away and got bigger. Consider the later Nissan Frontier, Ford Ranger, Chevy Colorado. They all got bigger because the profits were there. But in my mind, the market has been neglected. And that means there's a hole, there's a vacuum waiting for a small truck to come in there. We thought it was going to be the Maverick, but Ford couldn't meet their production requirements. They offered it at $20,000 with a hybrid, and they couldn't meet demand. I read a statistic where they could only produce about 33% hybrid, but they had about 73% demand for the hybrid. Interestingly, while they've raised the price and then made the hybrid an extra option, an add option in terms of $1,500 in price, they're now pushing the hybrid for the F-150. Ford is hollowing out their demand. And somebody needs to bring back a small truck here to America. Let me know your thoughts below, guys. I appreciate it.